The Catholic vote. In exclusive polling with Real Clear Politics, we examine the pulse of the faithful on key issues ahead of November's elections. Threat from Tehran. What President Joe Biden and Israel's leaders are saying about Iran's nuclear ambitions. Death of a statesman. New developments in the investigation into the murder of Shinzo Abe. And in his own words, an author tells us how the Catholic faith plays an important role in the life of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. On EWTN News Nightly for Thursday, July 14th, 2022. Well, thank you so much for being with us tonight on this feast of St. Katari Takakwitha. I'm Tracy Sable. We begin tonight with exclusive polling numbers that say President Joe Biden's popularity among Catholics is dropping. The study also finds a substantial majority of Catholics are less likely to vote for political candidates who support abortion until birth. The survey was conducted by EWTN News and Real Clear Opinion Research in late June, just before the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. It found among the faithful, President Biden has a favorable rate of 45% versus 53% unfavorable. In October 2020, then candidate Biden had a 52% favorable rate among Catholics. The poll also examined how inflation has affected the faithful. Nearly 9 out of 10 say their finances have been impacted a great deal or to some degree. Meantime, 60% of Catholics say they would not vote for a candidate who supports abortion until birth. This is the first installment of exclusive numbers from EWTN News and Real Clear Opinion Research. Part 2 tomorrow will examine current attitudes toward the Catholic faith. 2 future polls will track Catholic voters as general elections in November draw closer. From Real Clear Politics, we are joined by Andrew Walworth, Chief Content Officer, and Susan Crabtree, White House and National Political Correspondent, as well as Dr. Matthew Bunson, Executive Editor and Washington Bureau Chief for EWTN News. Thank you all so much for being with us. Andy, I want to start out with you. Tell us, what does this poll tell us about where Catholics are right now politically?
Well, it's bad news for the president. I think that would be the headline from this poll. I think Matthew would agree. One of the key numbers was that you've got 47% approval of the president right now among Catholics, 53% disapproval. We polled in February 2020, asked the same question. At that point, Trump had 47% and a 53% disapproval rating. Those are kind of magic numbers. What we know is that in 2020, Trump lost by about that same number. Certainly looking at the midterms now, it looks very bad for the president in terms of the numbers, especially with, like I said, among the Catholics. Yeah,
definitely, for sure. And Susan, I'm curious, what's your biggest takeaway from this first poll?
I thought it was interesting that the Catholic vote as a whole, we're talking all types of Catholics, those who go to church regularly, as well as those who only go once a year, that vote is split when we're looking at the midterms in November with just 4 months away. You had just 44% saying they would vote for a Republican candidate and 43% say they'll vote for a Democratic candidate. But there's a large chunk, 13%, who are still undecided. So it could still go either way and be a big win for Republicans, or Democrats could keep their majorities in Congress based on the Catholic vote alone. But you were seeing a little bit more spread, a little bit more support nationally for Republicans by about 4 percentage points. So this is a little bit less than that. I thought that was kind of significant. The Catholic vote is still gettable for both parties.
Yeah, and Matthew, compared, to the polls that EWTN News and Real Clear conducted back in 2020 for the presidential election, how do these polls compare?
Well, it's striking in a way because we're looking, and Andy kind of hinted at this, at an almost mirror image from our findings in 2020, but it's reversed for the president. He had a reservoir of very goodwill among Catholics heading into the election, and we know from polling of Catholics that he did, in fact, carry the Catholic vote. It's a question as to how the percentages played out. What we're seeing now is that we're seeing the absolute reverse. Now, it's closer than we're seeing with some of the national polls, where the president is in some cases now in the low 30s. He's buoyed, I think, to some degree in the Catholic vote today, as he was in 2020, by the Latino vote. But one of the most important telling factors that we're going to be paying very close attention to as we head into the midterms is the question of mass attendance as a determiner of where you're going to vote. We saw wide gulfs politically and even sacramentally and devotionally among Catholics as to how they vote. And there the president is under deeper water, about 55% disapproval. What's telling, though, is that we're within the margin of error right now for all Catholics, whether they go often or rarely. He's still underwater, so he has lost an immense amount of ground among Catholics compared to 2020.
Yeah, very interesting. Andy, based on this poll, what are some of the key issues for Catholics?
Well, the key issue for Catholics, as is for the country as a whole, is the economy. It's the economy. 89% say financial issues are their number one issue for them. Interestingly enough, and I think this is some good news for the president, when it comes to blaming, who to blame, Catholics say 36% blame Biden, 33% blame it on Ukraine. So this idea of a Putin's, it's a Putin gas hike might actually be working. 25% say it's both. So certainly the economy is number one for them, but we found that, of course, abortion, especially in light of the Supreme Court decision, is important as well. But way above all the others is the economy.
Yeah, for sure. And Susan, I want to bring you back in here, and we should mention, speaking of that, this poll was taken just before the Dobbs decision and the overturning of Roe versus Wade by the Supreme Court. That said, how does the question of abortion, how does that turn out in this poll? And also, what are you looking for in the next poll?
Well, it was interesting to me that a plurality of the total Catholic vote approved of favored upholding Roe v. Wade by a 47% to 42% margin with very little gender gap. There was more gender gap in the general public, but both men and women were narrowly opposed to overturning, which is exactly what the Supreme Court just did. And party affiliation obviously was the big factor, influential factor on that, with Republicans strongly supporting reversing the decision by a margin of 52% to 36%, while Democrats were opposed to doing so by 58% to 33%. But that doesn't tell the whole story, of course, when it comes to abortion. A high percentage of Catholics said, by 65%, said that abortion conflicts with Catholic teaching. And I thought it was very interesting that just 18% of those surveyed said abortion should be available at any point. So unfettered abortion should be available. That's a little bit up, 15% since we did the survey in 2020. But still, that's a huge margin who believes that there should be some regulation to abortion.
Yeah, and before we wrap things up, Matthew, I'm curious, talk to us about why polls like this are important to Catholics.
Well, they are. They're important because Catholics comprise 22% of the overall U.S. population. There are about 70 million Catholics. So Catholics matter. We have seen that in election after election. Who carries a Catholic vote consistently can predict who's going to win the presidency and who's going to dominate in midterm elections. In this case, the distribution of Catholics in battleground states that we're going to be focusing on, especially in the coming polls, are going to be decisive, I think, in who actually ends up controlling Congress. That's historically true. I think that's going to be very much true this year as well.
Well, certainly very interesting findings, and thank you all so very much for being here with us today. 3 young men have been arrested following a fire that destroyed a historic Catholic church last month in West Virginia. 2 of the suspects are 18 and 19 years old. The third is a juvenile. St. Coleman Catholic Church was built in the 1870s. It was on the National Register of Historic Places. In a statement, Bishop Mark Brennan says he is deeply saddened to learn that the fire is being considered an act of arson. On today, U.S. President Joe Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid declared that they will not allow Iran to become a nuclear power. White House correspondent Owen Jensen reports. Owen?
That's right, Tracy. U.S. President Joe Biden and Israel's Prime Minister absolutely do not want Iran getting a nuke. They made that very clear today. However, where they differ is how that critical goal is to be achieved.
Continuing his overseas trip to the Middle East, President Joe Biden tells Israeli Prime Minister Yair Lapid,
"You and I also discussed America's commitment to ensuring Iran never obtains a nuclear weapon. This is a vital security interest to both Israel and the United States, and I would add, for the rest of the world as well."
President Biden held out hope Iran can be persuaded.
"I continue to believe that diplomacy is the best way to achieve this outcome."
But the Israeli leader is not sold on talk.
The only thing that will stop Iran is knowing that if they continue to develop their nuclear program, the free world will use force.
Meanwhile, inflation at the wholesale level in the U.S. climbed 11.3% in June compared with a year earlier. Investors bracing for another big interest rate hike. The Republican National Committee tweets real wages are down 3.6% from last year. Joe Biden is the pay cut president. Meanwhile, Vice President Kamala Harris travels to Florida to discuss protecting abortion.
Let women, including the women of Florida, make those most personal decisions for themselves in consultation with their priest or their pastor or their rabbi.
Just the other day, the National Right to Life in a letter said, "We know that the Democratic Party of Abortion plans to use every trick at their disposal to try to thwart the Constitution and thwart the right of the people to govern themselves through their elected representatives. Court packing, creating new states, passing a federal abortion until birth paid for with tax dollars law. Anything goes for them as long as it prolongs the killing."
Now back to the president's overseas trip. Tomorrow he visits Saudi Arabia. And on the inflation front, listen to this, long lines are back at food banks around the United States. In fact, many people are coming in for the very first time due to soaring prices. At the White House, Owen Jensen, EWTN News Nightly.
Arizona's Attorney General is fighting a judge's ruling which blocks the state's near total ban on abortion. Mark Brnovich is appealing a judge's ruling which sided with abortion supporters that the terms of a 1901 law are vague and unconstitutional. In a separate case, a federal judge blocked a 2021 law granting all rights to unborn children. House Democrats say they will vote on several abortion bills by the end of the week. They include the Women's Health Protection Act, which critics say would allow abortion on demand. There is also a measure ensuring women have the right to travel to another state to seek an abortion. Capitol Hill correspondent Eric Rosales looks deeper into those bills.
I spoke with Congressman Chris Smith, chairman of the House Pro-Life Caucus, who's read every word of these abortion bills. He tells me that they go way beyond codifying Roe v. Wade, and he's sounding the alarm.
But it gets rid of all of the statutes that have passed over the last 50 years, like women's right to know laws, an end to dismemberment abortion at certain time periods, and even parental notification and parental consent laws.
The pro-life lawmaker says the Women's Health Protection Act would also nullify any state restrictions on abortion and permit unborn children to be killed even up to the moment of their birth for any reason, and would stop basic informed consent laws that ensure that women have all the relevant information before choosing an abortion. Senator Roger Marshall, an OBGYN who has delivered more than 5,000 babies, tells me ultrasounds make a difference.
Believe it or not, about half of women, when they look at the ultrasound, decide not to have an abortion. But these young ladies are going to need a lot of help. They need access to better nutrition. They got to stay in school. They're going to need some help after the baby gets here.
The other bill, which ensures women have the right to travel between states to get an abortion, also eliminates parental consent laws.
When you're bringing somebody from one state to another, and you're bringing a minor, that's against the law. It won't be against the law anymore.
I cannot believe I'm part of a Congress where I have to vote for a second time against the same bill that wants to federalize murdering babies in the womb up until the day of birth. I cannot believe it. I'm disgusted and heartsick over it.
Self-proclaimed Catholic House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says Democrats are determined to pass the abortion bills.
Respect freedom of reproductive health for women, and it's not about politicians negotiating that away.
Pro-life lawmakers believe that these bills will likely pass the House, but they believe Democrats don't have the votes to move this in the Senate and get this to the president's desk. At the Capitol, Eric Rosales, EWTN News Nightly.
Coming up, Japan's prime minister assigns blame for the assassination of his revered predecessor. Plus, why Taiwan held emergency drills yesterday. Japan's prime minister blames inadequate police protection for the assassination of Shinzo Abe.
全面的に点検をし、正すべきことは早急に正してもらいたいと思っています。
Fumio Kishida says an investigation is underway to determine why the gunman was able to fire from point-blank range while the former prime minister was delivering a public campaign speech. He also announced that a state funeral for the slain leader will be scheduled later this fall. Italy's president has rejected the resignation of the country's prime minister. Mario Draghi offered to step down after a key ally refused to back the government in a Senate vote aimed at lowering inflation. Italy's president instead told Draghi to go back to parliament and see if he can still garner overall support. Officials in Ukraine say at least 22 people were killed earlier today by Russian missiles. They say the strike also wounded around 100 others, adding Ukrainian defense systems struck down 2 missiles. No word from the Kremlin whether it was behind the strike. This was the latest round of violence since the military conflict began in late February. Taiwan has conducted an emergency preparedness drill today. The exercises simulated response to either a natural disaster or a possible missile attack by China, which routinely flies warplanes near the island. Multiple scenarios involved almost 2,000 first responders and volunteers, complete with equipment. Protesters left Sri Lanka's presidential palace today. Meantime, the capital city of Colombo stayed calm as the nation waits to learn if its president will resign. Protesters had occupied the residence since the weekend, demanding political change due to an ongoing economic crisis. Well, economic protests also took place today in Panama. Police chased some demonstrators through the streets of Panama City. Thousands of others blocked streets to demand price freezes against high costs for fuel and other basic living necessities. Up next, learn more about the faith journey of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Plus, what a Vatican astronomer is saying about the recently released photos of our galaxy. A new book looks at the life of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Created Equal, Clarence Thomas, in his own words, explores the people and experiences that shaped Justice Thomas and his values, including one of the key influences in his life, his Catholic faith. And joining us now to discuss is Mark Paoletta, co-author of the book Created Equal, Clarence Thomas, in his own words. Mark, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So tell us, why you decided to write this book, why you felt it was so important.
Sure. So there's a movie called Created Equal, Justice Clarence Thomas in his own words, that came out in 2020. Michael Pack made it. He's a great filmmaker. I was part of that. I worked with Michael on it. And it's a 2-hour film. And he interviewed Justice Thomas for 25 hours and Ginny Thomas, his wife, for 6 hours. And so when you make a 2-hour film, you're going to lose a lot of those exchanges. And so as I watched the interviews and thought, oh, these are great pieces that would be in the movie, just the nature of a film, you're not going to get that much in. So 90% of the interview was cut away. And I just thought that would be sort of a crime not to get Justice Thomas's words and thoughts on his life and his jurisprudence, on the cutting room floor. So after a year, we went to Regnery and thought, let's package this up into a book-length interview. So that's what it is. I'm sort of a co-editor of the book with Michael Pack, and it's basically that interview, 25 hours over 4 sessions.
Yeah, and he's such an extraordinary person. He came from very humble beginnings. Can you talk to us about that, him growing up in the segregated South, and also the influence that some religious sisters had on his life?
Yeah, so Justice Thomas probably has traveled further in terms of his life, where he started, to ending up on the Supreme Court, than any American in modern times, maybe ever. He was born into segregation, into abject poverty, to a mom who was basically single. The father left when he was 2, uneducated, three children she was trying to raise, but in a shanty with no electricity except for one light bulb in the house, an outhouse on the water, just poor. Then he moved into Savannah, where it was terrible. It was, he calls it rural poverty, urban poverty. And it was when he goes to live with his grandfather when he's 7 years old in 1955 that his life changes. And one of the things his grandfather does, who's a converted Catholic, is he enrolls him in St. Benedict's Catholic School, which is, again, a segregated school in the South. This is in the 1950s. And it's the Irish nuns who run this school that changed his life, along with his grandfather. And when you look at Justice Thomas's life, right up until today, he talks about his nuns and the impact they had on him. And there's one sister in particular, Sister Virgilius, who was his 8th grade teacher, and the principal, who was from Ireland. A lot of them were from Ireland, and they were tough. And they taught them that they loved them, but they were going to expect the most of them, right? They were not going to give them any excuses, not let them fall into victimhood, even though they were, sort of teaching them in the segregated South to get them ready, to have them learn their math and their English and their history, and to be ready for this world. And so that literally changed his life.
Yeah, and he still stays in touch with them, right?
He still stays in touch with them. For many years after he gone, in the 80s, when he was in the Reagan administration, he sought out those sisters. They were retired, some of them up in Massachusetts, Sister Virgilius, and he went to thank them for all they had done for him.
Amazing.
And Sister Virgilius actually testified on behalf of Justice Thomas in his confirmation hearings. And after he was confirmed, for about 10 or 15 years, we would drive up, generally on Martin Luther King Day, to visit Sister Virgilius, and there was probably 80 nuns at this retirement convent up in Tenafly, New Jersey. And we'd spend the day, and he'd visit each and every one and thank them. A lot of them were his teachers. And then last year, there was a statue that was dedicated to Sister Virgilius and it's the Franciscan Sisters of the Immaculate Conception Order. And so there's a statue up in New Jersey that is of Sister Virgilius. It's dedicated to the nuns who gave their life, who went into these tough areas, into the segregated South and all over the United States to teach children in disadvantaged areas. And, that's Justice Thomas's life through and through, is to be thankful for those who helped him.
Yeah, and obviously it had a huge impact on his life. Something else that a lot of people don't know is he was maybe not going to become Justice Thomas, but maybe Father Thomas.
That's right. So when he was an altar boy growing up, his grandfather kind of drilled it into him. He's going to a Catholic school, is a great altar boy. He becomes the lead altar boy, and he goes into the seminary, sort of the high school. It's called a minor seminary at the time, right outside of Savannah. He's in terms of those challenging times, he's the first one of 2 black students to enter this previously all-white seminary. So all those challenges that go with that, does very well. And then he goes into the seminary in Missouri, but because of some racial issues and him losing his vocation, he leaves the seminary after his first year and enters Holy Cross College. And I think it was Justice Thomas, he never lost his faith, he says. He was disappointed in the church and that they didn't do more for racial justice. And he turns away from the church when he goes to Holy Cross. But then there's a significant scene in the movie and in the book where he ends up at a riot in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1970. And he realizes he's really fallen away from his upbringing, from his grandfather's values, from the nuns' values. And he stops in front of the church at Holy Cross and he prays to God. He hadn't been in the church for a while, saying, if you take anger out of my heart, I will never hate again. And that, as he says, was a slow return to his faith.
Wow. Mark, so much more we can talk about. Such an extraordinary man. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much for sharing all this with us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Well, finally tonight, a Vatican astronomer calls the newest celestial images from the James Webb Space Telescope, quote, food for the human spirit. Brother Guy Consalamano says this is God's creation being revealed to us, and in it we can see both his astonishing power and his love of beauty. Brother Guy also celebrates the James Webb Telescope's success because he is friends with many who are involved in its mission. We thank you for watching tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Tracy Sable. We'll see you tomorrow with part 2 of our exclusive polling on Catholics and the Catholic vote. Good night and God bless.